All right, let's dive into the sonic world of the Behringer Spice. This synth that has been creating a lot of buzz, especially on Reddit.
Yeah, what's got everyone so intrigued is that the Spice is, well, it's a clone, or a replica if you prefer, of the Moog subharmonicon.
And the subharmonicon, for those who haven't encountered it,
It's this really wild, semi-modular analog synth.
known for generating these kind of otherworldly sounds.
And rhythms, too, but it comes with a pretty substantial price tag. So.
And that's where the Spice comes in, right?
Yeah, it's promising the same sonic playground, but at a much lower cost, like potentially hundreds of dollars less.
So we have a bunch of Behringer's marketing materials here, and we've also got this Reddit thread, which is pretty lively, debating the Spice's deleted release.
And a bunch of user comments that run the gamut from, like, pure excitement, yeah, to some serious skepticism.
So it's going to be an interesting deep dive today.
It really is a real mix of opinions.
Okay, let's unpack the Spice. For those who haven't been glued to the synth forums, like myself, what exactly is it and what makes it so special?
Well, think of it as a kind of portal to subharmonic and polyrhythmic exploration.
Okay.
The Spice, just like the subharmonicon, has two voltage-controlled oscillators, or VCOs.
VCOs.
Yeah, these generate the initial sound waves, right?
Right.
But here's where it gets really interesting. It's got 4 subharmonic oscillators layered on top.
Subharmonic oscillators. Okay, now I'm feeling a little lost.
No worries. It's a pretty cool concept, actually.
Okay.
Imagine you have a bass note playing. A subharmonic oscillator generates tones that are like fractions of that bass frequency. So like half, a quarter, or even an eighth of the original note.
Wow.
Creates this really rich, layered sound with a unique depth.
Yeah.
It's like adding like a secret sonic dimension.
I like that, secret sonic dimension.
Yeah.
Okay, so that explains the subharmonic part. But what about the polyrhythmic? That sounds even a little more intimidating.
Yeah, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Polyrhythms are basically multiple rhythms happening at the same time. Think of it like 2 drummers playing different patterns that somehow lock together in a cool, unexpected way.
Yeah.
The Spice achieves this with 2 sequencers, each with 4 steps and 4 rhythm generators.
Sequencers, rhythm generators, are we building a robot orchestra here?
It's not that far off, actually. The sequencers are kind of like mini composers spitting out notes in a predetermined order, and the rhythm generators add another layer of complexity, creating these pulsating patterns that interact with the sequencers. So it's a recipe for like some seriously mind-bending rhythms.
So basically this thing is designed to make sounds that are both deep and complex.
Yeah, like a sonic kaleidoscope.
No wonder people are geeking out over this.
Exactly.
And we can't forget about the 32-point patch matrix. This is where the semi-modular part comes in.
All right.
Break that down for me. What does semi-modular even mean?
It's like having a synth with a built-in set of connections, but you also have the freedom to reroute signals and create your own unique pathways. Imagine like a control panel with a bunch of jacks and cables.
Okay.
You can plug things in different ways to change how the synth behaves, you know, creating unexpected sounds and textures. It's kind of like having a sonic Lego set.
So it's pre-wired for convenience, but also open to experimentation. That's cool. But we do have to address the elephant in the room here.
Right.
This isn't exactly an original Behringer design, is it?
Yeah, that's right. The Spice is generating all this buzz because it's essentially Behringer's take on the Moog subharmonicon.
Right.
And that brings up a lot of questions about, you know, cloning, innovation, and the ethics of borrowing inspiration in the music tech world.
And those questions are playing out right now in real time in this Reddit thread we have here.
Yeah.
It's titled, "Whatever Happened to the Behringer Spice?"
Right.
Clearly people are excited, but maybe a little impatient.
Yeah, there's definitely some skepticism there.
Yeah.
You see, Behringer has a bit of a reputation for announcing products and then taking their time actually releasing them.
Yeah, I've heard about this. It's like Behringer time operates on a different dimension.
Right, exactly. Some users are bringing up examples like the UBXE, their clone of the Oberheim OBXE. That was announced back in 2019, but didn't actually come out until 2022.
Wow, that's a while.
So there's definitely a sense of like, we'll believe it when we see it.
Yeah.
When it comes to Behringer release dates.
But beyond the release date drama, there's a deeper conversation happening here, right?
Absolutely.
About Behringer's whole approach to cloning.
Yeah, and that's where the Reddit thread gets really interesting.
Okay.
Some users are praising Behringer for making these types of instruments more accessible. They're arguing that not everyone can afford a top-of-the-line Moog, and Behringer is opening up a world of possibilities for musicians on a budget.
Yeah, that argument definitely resonates, especially with, the state of the economy these days. Yeah. But I'm guessing not everyone is fully on board with this whole cloning thing.
You're right. There are definitely some voices expressing concern about the ethics of it all, particularly in a niche market like synthesizers.
Right.
They worry that it stifles innovation and undermines the original creators.
Yeah, it must be frustrating if you spend years developing, a truly unique product to see it replicated and sold for much cheaper.
Yeah, but then you have the counter-arguments. Some users are pointing out that guitar pedal clones are pretty accepted in the music industry.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So why the double standard when it comes to synths?
Right. It seems like the line between inspiration and copying can be, pretty blurry.
Yeah, and where you draw that line might depend on your own perspective. And some users argue that Behringer is actually pushing the industry forward by forcing other manufacturers to innovate and offer better products at more competitive prices.
So it's kind of a healthy form of competition.
Yeah, they see it as a healthy form of competition that ultimately benefits consumers.
So it's a complex issue.
Yeah.
There are valid points on both sides.
Absolutely.
There's the accessibility argument, the concern about originality, and the potential impact on, the market.
Yeah, and to make things even more nuanced, some users are suggesting that Behringer is intentionally delaying the Spice's release.
Okay.
To avoid cannibalizing sales of their Edge synthesizer.
And the Edge is?
Which is their clone of the Moog DFAM.
Oh, right, the DFAM. Remind me what the DFAM is all about.
It's a percussive synth known for creating gritty industrial sounds.
Okay.
The sonic equivalent of a rusty factory.
Got it. So the theory is that Behringer doesn't want to flood the market with too many affordable Moog clones at once.
Right. They're playing a strategic game.
It makes sense from a business perspective, but it also raises questions about their motives.
Right.
Are they genuinely trying to make, music technology more accessible, or are they just driven by profit?
It's a tough question. Maybe it's a bit of both.
Yeah.
But let's dive into some of these individual Reddit comments and see what we can find.
Okay, let's do it.
Here's one that caught my eye. A user writes, I actually own the Moog Subharmonicon, but I'm still seriously considering getting the Spice.
Wait, so someone who already has, the real deal is still tempted by the clone?
Right.
Why would that be?
Well, they go on to explain that they're frustrated with the Moog's kind of limited MIDI implementation.
Okay.
Apparently, the Spice has improved MIDI capabilities, which would make it much easier to integrate into their setup.
Right, because MIDI is crucial for, connecting synths to computers and other gear.
Absolutely, and it highlights the fact that Behringer isn't just creating, exact copies.
Yeah.
They're often making modifications and adding features that might actually improve upon the originals, at least in terms of functionality.
So even in the act of cloning, there's still room for some innovation.
Exactly.
Okay, what else do we have here?
Okay, here's a comment that takes a more critical stance.
Okay.
The user writes, Behringer is just preying on Moog's efforts to make synths more affordable. They're stealing market share and potentially discouraging Moog from continuing to release budget-friendly instruments.
Wow, that's a strong accusation.
Yeah.
How do they back that up?
Well, they point to the fact that Moog has been releasing, more affordable instruments in recent years, like the Mother 32 and the DFAM, both of which Behringer has cloned.
Right.
And they worry that Behringer is undercutting Moog's pricing strategy.
Right.
And potentially, harming their ability to innovate.
In the affordable synth market, yeah. It raises the question of whether Behringer is helping or, actually hindering the goal of making music more accessible.
Exactly. And it shows that even within, the pro-accessibility camp, there are nuances and disagreements about the best way to achieve that goal.
Okay, let's hear from the Behringer defenders now. What are they saying in response to this?
Well, they're pushing back pretty hard against this idea. One user writes, competition is good for consumers. Behringer is forcing Moog to step up their game.
Yeah, the classic free market argument.
Exactly. They believe that Behringer's presence in the market is ultimately, beneficial, even if it ruffles some feathers along the way. They argue that it keeps prices in check and encourages everyone to innovate.
So we've got a clash of ideologies here.
We do.
On one hand, this concern that Behringer is disrupting a delicate ecosystem.
Right.
And on the other hand, the belief that competition ultimately leads to progress.
Yeah, and that brings us to a pretty crucial question. Where do you stand on this debate?
Yeah, that is the question, isn't it?
Do you see Behringer as a force for good or, well, not so good in the music tech world?
Tough call.
It is.
But that's what makes this deep dive so interesting.
It really is.
It's not just about the specs of, a synthesizer. It's also about the philosophical and economic implications of cloning, accessibility, and the music industry.
And before we get too lost in the philosophy of all this, let's bring it back to the two synths at the heart of this.
Yeah.
The Moog subharmonicon and the Behringer Spice. Let's compare and contrast them a bit more closely.
Sounds good. What are the key differences besides the obvious, price gap?
Well, we've already talked about the MIDI implementation, which seems to favor the Spice.
Right.
But beyond that, there are probably differences in build quality and component selection.
Okay.
Some users are speculating that Behringer might be using their own audio chips.
Oh, okay.
In the Spice rather than sourcing the same ones as Moog.
Which, of course, could affect the sound.
Exactly. Audio chips are kind of like the brain of a synth.
Yeah.
Shaping the way it generates sound.
And that's where things get tricky, right?
Yeah.
Because sound quality is so subjective.
It is. It's impossible to judge definitively without having both synths side by side.
Yeah.
And just listening.
The ear test.
Yeah.
The ultimate decider.
Exactly. But even then, it comes down to, personal preference.
Yeah.
Some people might prefer the warmer sound of the Moog, while others might like a sharper, more modern sound.
Yeah.
The Behringer.
And there's also the intangible factor of owning a Moog. There's a certain prestige and history associated with that brand.
Oh, yeah.
That some people find really appealing.
Absolutely.
It's like buying a vintage Gibson guitar versus a modern Epiphone.
Right.
The quality might be comparable, but there's a mystique about the original.
Yeah.
So for you, the listener, it all comes down to your priorities and your budget.
Exactly.
What factors would influence your decision?
Yeah, think about the sound you're looking for, the importance of features like MIDI, the value you place on build quality and brand reputation, and of course, the cost.
That's a lot to consider.
But that's the beauty of, having options.
It is. And that's where we'll pick things up in part 2.
Okay.
We'll continue exploring these Reddit reactions.
Yeah. Delve deeper into this Moog versus Behringer comparison.
Okay.
And uncover some more insights about the future of music tech.
Stay tuned, folks. We're just getting started.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the Behringer Spice, where we're exploring this synth and all the discussions it's starting up online.
Before we went off on that tangent, we were looking at the Spice in the Moog subharmonicon and digging into the Reddit comments.
Right.
And there's this one comment I want to bring up because it really gets to the heart of this whole Behringer clone thing.
Oh, yeah, I think I know which one you're talking about. This user who asks, is Behringer really democratizing music tech, or are they just ripping off other companies?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's the big question, isn't it? It's easy to get caught up in all the excitement for cheaper gear, but we also have to think about the ethics of it.
Yeah, and the economic side of things, too. If Behringer is putting out all these clones so cheap, could that actually hurt innovation? Will companies like Moog want to take risks and make new instruments if they think Behringer's just going to come along and copy them?
It's a valid concern. But on the other hand, there's something to be said for making music technology, more accessible. And not everyone can afford a $1,000 synth. Especially if they're, just getting started.
That's true, and that's where the argument for democratization comes in. Behringer is bringing down the barrier to entry, there's no doubt.
Yeah.
They're making it possible for people to experiment with sounds that they couldn't before.
Yeah, and let's not forget, the Spice is more than just a cheap copycat, right?
Yeah.
We've already talked about how the MIDI is better, which could make it better for some musicians, even if they could afford the Moog.
Right. Behringer isn't just copying. They're changing things up, adding things, and kind of tweaking the designs in a way that might work for some people.
So maybe it's not a zero-sum game. Maybe there's space for both the originals and the clones, to exist together and even kind of push each other to get better.
I think that's a really interesting way to look at it. It's not really about taking sides, but seeing that there are a lot of different points of view and how things could turn out. The music tech world is a complicated place, and it's always changing.
Speaking of change, there's a comment here that caught my eye. Someone wrote, "I'm just happy someone's making synths that don't look like they came from the 70s.
Yeah, the whole look of it. It's another part of this discussion.
Exactly. Some people love that vintage look while others think it's dated and maybe even a little scary.
Yeah, and Behringer's definitely going for those people who don't like the old look. Their synths have a more modern, sleek design. They use, bright colors and interesting layouts.
It's like they're trying to appeal to a newer generation of musicians who are more used to like, digital screens and cool gadgets.
Exactly. And that might be another reason why they're doing so well. They're not just making cheap clones, they're also making them look, fresh and new.
Like they're saying, hey, analog synths can be cool and easy to use too. You don't have to be some like, synth expert in a basement to enjoy them.
And it seems like people are really liking that.
All right, let's jump back into this Reddit thread. What else can we find in here? There's a comment that started a whole conversation about the sound quality of Behringer synths.
Oh, yeah. That comes up all the time in the synth world. The question of whether Behringer synths can really sound like the ones they're copying.
Yeah.
Right?
This person writes, I've heard some demos of the Behringer Model D, and it sounds pretty close to the Moog Mini Moog. But can the Spice really sound as good as the Subharmonicon?
Yeah, that's the big test, right?
Yeah.
Can a clone really sound exactly the same? It's a tough question because it's like really subjective.
Yeah, some people might hear the difference right away while others won't even notice. And then there's like the placebo effect, right?
Right, yeah.
If you think you're listening to a Moog, it might actually sound better to you.
Our brains can be tricked so easily, especially with something like sound.
Yeah, but even beyond that, there are some, technical things to consider. We were talking earlier about Behringer maybe using their own audio chips.
Right.
And the parts used can definitely change how a synth sounds.
Yeah, different audio chips have their own like little quirks,
Oh, okay.
And those can lead to small changes in the tone, how warm it sounds, and the overall texture.
It's kind of like cooking with gas versus electric.
Yeah. Both can make good food, but the taste might be a little different.
Right. And how a synth sounds also depends on a lot of other things, like how you play it, the effects, and the whole song.
Exactly. So you can't really say for sure how good it sounds based on, just specs and guesses.
Yeah.
We'll just have to wait till the Spice comes out and people can actually play it.
I could already picture all those YouTube demos and comparisons. It's going to be fun to see.
Yeah. Speaking of comparisons, there's a comment here that brings up something interesting about how Behringer is affecting the market for used synths.
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that. Tell me more.
This user says, I'm wondering if the Spice coming out will make used Moog subharmonicons cheaper. If people can get a similar sound for less, will anyone still want the original?
That's a good question. It's like supply and demand, right?
Yeah.
If suddenly there's more subharmonic synths around, will the price of the old ones go down?
It could definitely happen. We've
Right.
seen this happen before. Like when Behringer released their DeepMind 12, which is a clone of the Roland Juno 106, the price of used Juno 106s went down.
So if you've been wanting a Moog subharmonicon, but it's been, too expensive, maybe the Spice coming out could actually be good news for you.
Yeah, it might be your chance to get a used one for a better price.
But it also makes you think about how much these instruments will be worth in the future.
Yeah.
If there were so many cheaper clones, will the original still be valuable to collectors?
Hard to say. Probably depends on the specific instrument and, how important it was. Some vintage synths will always be popular, no matter how many clones there are. But for newer ones like the Subharmonicon, it's harder to know how clones will affect their resale value. It's definitely something to watch.
Definitely. And it just shows that the music tech world is always changing. The choices we make now can have big effects later on,
Yeah, it's like we're all part of this big experiment and we don't know what's going to happen next.
And that's kind of exciting, isn't it?
It is. So many possibilities, both with the sounds and with how things work in the market.
We've talked about a lot in this part of our deep dive. We've looked at cloning, how it could affect innovation and the market, and even how sound and looks play into it all.
Yeah, and we're not even done with this Reddit thread. There's still so much more to talk about.
So we're going to take a little break and be back for part 3 of our deep dive into the Behringer Spice.
Right.
Stay tuned for more about sounds and all the interesting discussions around this synth. Welcome back, everybody. We're in the home stretch now of our deep dive into the Behringer Spice, a synth that seems to have sparked a lot of conversation.
It's been a journey, for sure.
We've gone from the technical side to the ethics of it all.
Yeah, and analyzed market trends.
And even, thought about sound and aesthetics.
And through all of that, we've been listening to what the Reddit community has to say.
Those passionate synth lovers who are always ready to share their opinions, good and bad.
And speaking of strong opinions, there's one comment I think sums up how a lot of people feel about Behringer. That love-hate kind of thing.
Okay, give it to me.
This user says, I know Behringer has its problems, but I gotta admit, they're making synths fun again.
Okay.
They're bringing back the excitement and experimentation that's sometimes missing with all that expensive, fancy gear.
I like that. Music shouldn't be just for the elite, you know? It should be for anyone who has the passion to create.
Yeah, and Behringer is definitely tapping into that.
Right.
They're offering a way into the world of analog synths, a world that can seem scary and expensive.
But it's not just about making them affordable, right?
Right, yeah.
It's also about making them approachable and, cool.
Absolutely. They're challenging the idea that analog synths have to be these old, mysterious things full of technical terms.
Yeah.
They're bringing back a sense of playfulness and just trying things out.
Like they're saying, you don't need to be an expert, just plug in, turn some knobs, and see what happens.
Yeah. People are really liking that, especially those who might have been intimidated by the old way of doing things with analog synths.
Now let's talk about one of the coolest things about the Spice. Its focus on subharmonic and polyrhythmic synthesis.
Right.
These concepts can be a bit confusing, but they can also open up some really unique sound possibilities.
Definitely. We touched on these before, but it's worth diving a little deeper to understand why the Spice is so interesting.
Okay, so subharmonics, how do they work?
Imagine a note playing, let's say, a C. A subharmonic oscillator makes tones that are fractions of that note's frequency.
Okay.
So you might hear a C an octave lower, then another one 2 octaves lower, and so on. It creates this kind of cascading effect, making the sound deeper and richer.
It's like those fractal pictures,
Yeah.
Getting smaller and smaller, but always keeping the same shape.
Yeah, great analogy. And what's cool is that subharmonics create these undertones that you might not even notice consciously, but they make the sound more complex.
Like a secret ingredient.
Exactly. And when you combine subharmonics with polyrhythms, things get really interesting.
Polyrhythms, remind me again.
Oh.
I'm still trying to wrap my head around it.
It's like two drummers playing different rhythms that fit together in a cool, unexpected way.
Okay.
Instead of a simple beat, you have these multiple rhythms happening at the same time.
So it's like controlled chaos.
Kind of, but it's a chaos that can be really musical.
Yeah.
And the Spice gives you ways to shape and control these polyrhythms.
Okay.
You can use the sequencers to program notes and the rhythm generators to create these pulsing rhythms.
That sounds like it could make some really interesting music.
It definitely can. And it's a type of sound that experimental composers and electronic music pioneers have been exploring for a long time.
Right.
But the Spice makes it easier than ever.
And that brings us back to something we've been talking about a lot, this balance between making things accessible and innovation.
Yeah.
Behringer gets criticized for copying, but they're also making these amazing sound tools available to more people.
Right. And that's a debate that will keep going. As technology gets better, we're going to see more instruments that blur the line between what's original and what's a copy, what's inspiration, and what's imitation.
Yeah, and as consumers, we're going to have to think about the ethics and, the business side of it all. Do we support the people making new things or the companies making them cheaper?
It's a tough question with no easy answers. But by having these conversations and thinking about the long-term effects of our choices, we can hopefully navigate this changing world in a way that works for everyone.
And who knows, maybe these cheaper clones will actually lead to more innovation as companies try to stand out and make even more unique and exciting instruments.
That's an optimistic view, but it's definitely possible. Competition can make everyone work harder.
So to wrap up our deep dive into the Behringer Spice, let's leave our listeners with a question.
Okay.
In a world where it's getting harder to tell the difference between what's original and what's a copy, how do we define innovation? And how do we, as both consumers and creators, shape the future of music technology?
Those are big questions that we'll keep thinking about as music tech keeps changing. But one thing's for sure, the conversation is just getting started.
Thanks for joining us on this sonic journey. We hope you've enjoyed exploring the Behringer Spice, the discussions around it, and the bigger questions about accessibility, innovation, and the future of music.
Until next time, keep creating, keep exploring, and keep diving deep.
See you next time.